Now, when we get to the containment stage, this is a big one, right? And so at this point, we've prepared our incident response plan and capabilities, and we've identified and confirmed a genuine incident is occurring. And so the question is, what should we do now? Well, we need to shift our focus to mitigating the immediate damage caused by the incident, whatever it may be, right? If it's an account compromise, or a data breach, or maybe malware spreading through the network, our primary goal of the containment phase is to stop the bleeding, so to speak, and limit the spread of the threat. And by doing so, well, we can hopefully prevent further damage to our organization's systems and data. And so here, we're really thinking about taking certain actions against the adversary, but with an extremely important caveat here. We first need to understand the adversary. And if anything here, I would say that this is the most important takeaway as it relates to the containment stage. We need to first understand the attacker and where they're at from a procedural level before we can come up with an appropriate containment strategy. What's actually taking place on the network? How are the attackers operating? Where might they be within their attack chain or within the kill chain? Right? Importantly, how did they initially enter the network? Right? What was that initial point of entry? And how are they persisting, right? Have they installed any backdoors on any of the systems that they've taken over? How is the command and control being done? And again, scope-wise, which systems do they have control over? And how are they moving around on the network between these systems, right? How are they moving their tools around, or different loot that they come across, or staging for exfiltration? How is all of this being done? And this takes a lot of investigation to answer. And so the list of investigative questions here really goes on as we understand the scope of the intrusion. And this is really why containment is so interconnected to identification, despite the fact that a lot of the standard models that we see sometimes don't draw that conclusion. We have this ever-iterative feedback loop going on where, as we find these answers and the indicators and artifacts that come with them, we begin to understand the adversary more and more. And as we understand the adversary more through forensic analysis, we can identify additional previously unknown compromised systems or different indicators of compromise and continue growing our scope and continue this iterative feedback loop. Right? And so we're often going to be living in this identification and containment loop for a while. Oftentimes, this is the longest period of the incident response process because we have to get it right. And sometimes the stakes are really high in getting it right the first time. It's not only until we achieve this full and complete understanding do we even think about heading into eradication and recovery. A big pitfall, an outright mistake that we see many organizations or incident response teams make is jumping straight to remediation without first fully understanding the scope and impact of the incident. Right? It's natural to feel an immediate urge to act in the moment when we discover a compromised system. Right? It's incredibly difficult to just sit and watch attackers operate once we know that they're inside the network. Right? You just feel very uneasy. It's very unnatural. The instinct is to do something, right? To start taking systems offline, or physically pulling out Ethernet cables, or isolating affected machines as quickly as possible, or even start blocking domains or IPs. Even things like re-imaging systems from a known good state, or disabling user accounts and re-rolling credentials or keys. But why wouldn't we want to immediately remove compromised systems from the network? The reality is, if we've identified one or two compromised machines, it's likely that the attackers already established a larger foothold on the network, right? There might be another 20 or 30 or more compromised assets that we haven't discovered yet. If we start reacting to just the systems that we know about, well, we risk tipping off the attacker that we're onto them. And once they realize that, they're very likely to adapt their tactics or maybe escalate their actions to maintain access, right? Or they might hop over to another foothold and maybe expedite their actions on objectives, or clean up their tracks and implement anti-forensic techniques and wipe away a lot of valuable evidence. And also, if we, start pulling power out of running systems, well, physically systems need power. And it's going to completely shut down if we do this, and most likely wipe away a lot of volatile evidence that we would want to capture to perform forensic analysis and understand the incident better. Now, That, of course, isn't to say that we shouldn't contain or we shouldn't isolate a compromised system, right? Of course, we want to do this. We just have to take calculated actions before acting irrationally. It really just takes time to understand the full scope of the intrusion and the attacker's behavior, right? Again, we want to be able to answer questions like, how did they initially enter the network? What was that initial point of entry? How are they pivoting laterally around the environment, right? What backdoors or persistence have they installed? Importantly, what accounts and credentials have they compromised? Right? And that's sometimes hard to investigate, but as we'll see, almost everything in Windows that an attacker wants to do is going to require credentials or a valid account, right? And so this is one of the biggest things that we can do is figure out which accounts have been compromised. And so the list really goes on here, but until we can answer many of these questions and build up that context and sort of build up a full picture of the attack, jumping immediately into remediation can be risky, right? We really need to avoid playing whack-a-mole here, where maybe we shut down one system and the attacker simply pivots over to another one that they still control. Right? We don't want to be chasing the attacker around the network. They're always going to be one step ahead of us in that case. And that's one of the biggest challenges with containment and incident response. And I'm sure this is something a lot of you are thinking, right? It can be very difficult to convince executives or stakeholders to just hold back, right? To knowingly leave an attacker active in the environment while we gather intelligence. And so this can be a very tough hill to climb or a battle to fight, right? And oftentimes it just comes down to clearly communicating the risks, right? Explaining what we know, what's known and what's unknown, and why a more calculated approach to understand the attack more is necessary to ensure a successful eradication. Now, and I get it, right? We have to also be realistic here. Of course, there's going to be scenarios where waiting just isn't an option. Right? If we know that the attackers gain access to very critical systems, right? Or if we're, physically watching some kind of destructive attack in real time, well, then containment and remediation might need to happen immediately to simply prevent unrecoverable damage, right? In these cases, we often have to quickly roll out oftentimes a short-term containment plan and then work with data owners to find that long-term balance. Because that's an important point too. Right? When deciding and implementing a containment strategy, something we also need to consider is the potential business impact of the actions that we're taking. We have to remember that this is a business, right? It's an organization. Applications and servers and data. This is all part of the infrastructure that makes the organization money. And so while containment, is our overarching goal here, we also need to minimize disruption to business operations as much as feasibly possible. And this is, again, why the planning stages of incident response is so important, particularly things like our tabletop exercises. Right? It's important to sit down with these data owners and executives and other stakeholders to walk through potential incidents and how we can best handle them, and approach our solution from not only the security perspective, but also think about business operation and management as well. Right? And so we can test our containment strategy in advance to understand what would the potential impact look like? And what would our anticipated recovery times look like, right? If we have to re-roll credentials for the entire enterprise, or if we have to build up a server from scratch, or re-image one, what does this look like from a business impact perspective? Because in many cases, data owners or business stakeholders play the most important role in dictating and making those final decisions on containment strategies, right? The data owner is, by definition, the one who owns the data, right? They're responsible for the damage. And so they get a lot of say on what we do with the incident. And so as part of the incident response team, we often need to negotiate or present our perspective in what we know, and then design a more long-term containment strategy. But in general, the incident response process is designed with that intentional watch and wait approach, right? The goal is to gather enough intelligence to close all of the attacker's access points at the same time during remediation, and fully kicking them out of the network and preventing any chances of re-entry and successfully restoring business operations with confidence. And so this is where we're going to spend the most time during this course, because really from a practical standpoint, our job is to be able to effectively identify and scope an incident in order to effectively contain and remediate it. right? We need to know how to track adversaries and understand their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and use that to find the full extent of the compromise. And so the strategies and actions we perform during the containment phase are going to set the stage for the eradication phase, right? And so once the threat is contained and we've acquired our forensic evidence and artifacts, the focus can then shift to removing the root cause of the incident. And all the lessons that we've learned during containment, right? Like things like understanding how the threat spread and which systems were affected, and all of the various indicators of compromise or IOCs, or persistence mechanisms, or lateral movement artifacts we identify during forensic analysis, or different malware or C2 beacons that were dropped. Well, all of this is going to allow for a successful eradication across the enterprise.